Hello and welcome to ET Energy World. I am Sudhir and this is an exclusive interaction with Nakul Raheja, Country Head of Shell Energy India. Welcome to this platform, Nakul.
Thank you, Sudhir.
Let me begin this conversation by and asking you about, if there's one thing that defines the global and the Indian energy markets, particularly global markets in the past some time, it's volatility, right? That has had its impact across, supply, demand, pricing, etc. How do you, as a energy sector professional and a leader, how do you view this entire scene? Where do you see it's headed?
Thanks, Sudhir, and pleasure to be here to be talking to you this morning. Indeed, I've been a gas person all my life in my entire career, and I don't think I've ever seen market conditions of the type that we've seen over the last 12 months. In fact, at Shell, we've just published our LNG outlook for the year 2023. It's an annual publication we make every year where we talk about what's happened in the LNG space over the last 12 months and what the supply and demand outlook is. And actually, one of the things that comes out very clearly is how the LNG market has changed over this last 1 year, primarily, of course, driven by the war in Ukraine. And that, of course, has changed the nature and the flow of LNG around the world. You've basically had a situation where Europe has looked to replace its largest gas supplier, at a very, very short notice. And that change has been made possible by acquiring large amounts of LNG. So you've seen Europe import something like 60% more LNG last year, equivalent to about 45 million tons of additional LNG flowed into Europe last year. And that was only made possible because Europe was prepared to pay a premium to pull those volumes away from the rest of the world and mainly from Asia. So again, to put it into context, the world LNG market is about a 400 million tons per annum market, and you had Europe alone pulling in an additional 45 million tons last year. New supplies from new projects was about 16 million tons of additional production last year. And what that meant was a number of other factors had to come into play to allow that gas to flow to Europe. So you had demand destruction happening in a large way in Europe in particular. So you've seen both households as well as industries move away from gas and reduce their consumption in order to balance the market. And you also saw large amounts of LNG flow away from China, where they were previously destined, and into Europe. And likewise also from Asia and South America. That's literally what's allowed the world's LNG market to balance. But as a result, you've got a complete change of flows, where previously Europe used to act as what we used to call a balancing market. So if there was surplus LNG, for example, floating around in the world, it would go to Europe as a destination. From that, Europe has actually transformed into becoming a premium market, where it's paying the highest prices in the world to attract that LNG to come into Europe. And of course, that's had implications for the global market, and no country has been left untouched, including, of course, India as well.
Thanks for that understanding, Nakul. The other thing that I want to ask you is, all of this volatility, if you really look at it, it's in a way it's a difficult thing to handle. It may be a difficult thing to handle for a country like India, because we want energy-led growth, we want energy security also, and in all of that, in the middle of that, we also want the consumer to be protected. So how should we go about it? What should be the right strategy for a heavily import-dependent, when it comes to energy, country like India? How should we, strategize?
I think that's a great question, Sudhir. So we often talk about the energy trilemma, right? When we want our energy supplies to be reliable, we want them to be affordable, and we want them to be sustainable, right? So if I take each of those elements in turn, LNG is actually a great way to ensure reliable supply. I mean, the fact that Europe could replace volumes coming out of a pipeline from Russia with large amounts of LNG just shows how flexible and reliable LNG supply can be. So on the reliability score, actually LNG, does quite well. From a sustainability point of view, in most applications where gas goes, it's usually displacing a dirtier fuel. So whether you're talking about transport, whether you're talking about industry, whether you're talking about power, gas is usually replacing something which has a higher carbon footprint or is more polluting in general. So in general, it's supporting countries' sustainability goals, at least in the short and medium term, as they begin to kind of decarbonize and go on their own decarbonization pathways. Right. So again, in that direction, as India proceeds towards its own kind of net zero ambition in 2070, gas is part of the solution, for the next few decades to come in particular. The big challenge has, of course, been around affordability. And to your previous question also around the volatility in the spot price hasn't helped. But what has endured even in this highly volatile period has been the relative stability of term LNG prices. So LNG that was being bought under medium and long-term contracts, those prices have remained much more stable even over the last 12 months. The extreme volatility has really been in the spot market. So I think one of the lessons for India is, because we are not looking at gas in an opportunistic sense, we are looking at gas to enable a lot of our energy-led growth, as you said. We need more gas going forward, and LNG is going to be an important part of that mix of gas that as we go forward. We need to kind of think more strategically about how we contract for that gas, in the future. That means that we can, look at entering into more long-term contracts in general. And this is also something that the world has tended to do in the last few years. We've seen something like an additional 75 million tons of new LNG long-term contracts being entered into in the last year or two, right? So this is an industry that's underpinned by long-term contracts, and India has the opportunity to connect its own long-term demand with long-term supply, and that will help dampen a lot of the volatility. So effectively, you need a mix of long-term contracts, and you want to leave some volume open for optimization. If spot prices are low, you want to bring in, more spot volumes, but you want to kind of maintain a healthy balance between long-term and spot purchases as a country going forward.
Okay. So, given all this background, I want to ask you, what is the long-term, outlook that you have for the natural gas sector or the natural gas industry, particularly in India and globally also? Yeah.
So I think we see a very bright future for gas and for LNG, Sudhir, globally as well as in India. So as I was saying to you, right now the global LNG business is about a 400 million ton market at the moment. Most third-party forecasts that you can see take this volume out to 650 to about 700 million tons by around 2040, right, depending on which forecast you're reading. The story in India is quite similar as well. We are, just about 20 million tons of LNG imports at the moment. We're seeing this go up to something like 40 million tons, by within about, let's say, a little more than a decade. Some of it is price dependent, of course, but that is really the opportunity, that resides in India. The Prime Minister himself, has been very vocal, including in the last few weeks, in reiterating our endeavor that the gas-based economy is actually one of the pillars, of the Indian economy. And what that means is that we are expecting to see, large amount of growth for gas in India. The government talks about moving from 6% in the energy mix to 15% in the energy mix. So we are talking about going from about 160 million cubic meters a day today to, if you take that number, to about 500 million cubic meters a day by 2030. That's like a threefold increase in a very short span of time, within about a decade. So, clearly there's massive room for growth. If I then break this down, right, and I see, okay, where is this growth going to come from? A lot of work has been done by the government in a number of sectors. We are seeing the fertilizer sector, for example, massively increase its demand for gas, because we're increasingly moving towards being Atmanirbhar as far as urea and fertilizer production in general has been concerned. So more and more urea plants have been built, more and more urea plants have been connected to pipelines, and therefore, we are producing more fertilizer in India rather than relying on imports. In city gas, you're very well aware of the initiatives the government and the regulator have taken. Practically the entire country has now been licensed out to various CGD operators who are now building out these networks, touching practically, every corner of the country. That's going to lead to a massive increase in demand, particularly from transport for CNG, residential, as well as the industrial customers that they connect as well. So, across the piece, we are seeing demand growth. There are a couple of segments perhaps where there's still untapped potential. One is power in particular, right, where we've actually seen gas move out of the sector because of the high prices in particular. But then as we bring in more and more renewables into the mix, we are going to see more and more intermittency as part of our overall grid. And gas is kind of the best friend of renewables in firming up that supply and managing that intermittency. We're seeing this in various parts of the world. So as we kind of increase...
What is popularly known as a bridge.
A bridge as well. But yeah, so while batteries are really expensive, gas provides you a great solution to firm up when the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing, to ensure that the grid is balanced and you're not suffering as a result of the intermittency that you're seeing that comes with renewables. And this is the case in many markets in the world where gas is already kind of beginning to play this role. So there's massive opportunity for gas to kind of step up and play that role of best friend to renewables in power. In transport as well, there is an untapped segment in the heavy duty vehicles segment where you can use LNG as a transport fuel to displace diesel. So it's both cleaner and traditionally cheaper than diesel. And as you look to penetrate what is a very large fleet of heavy duty vehicles around the country, you can shift that to a cleaner and cheaper fuel, and therefore again massively increase the penetration of gas in that market as well. So overall, kind of we're seeing very large untapped potential for gas in the market. I think what is really needed is for us to kind of as a country perhaps have a very systematic roadmap which will set out the exact steps we take as a country, so that over the next 10 years, investors and market participants have that clarity to kind of go ahead with their investments, with their contracts. So I spoke about long-term contracts, for example, right, as being the way forward. Long-term contracts requires visibility of long-term demand. If you're the consumer who's signing up to a long-term contract, you want to have confidence that I need this gas over this period. And if I have that strong signal from the market, I'm comfortable to enter into that long-term contract, number one. Number two, you need instruments to manage the risk that comes with long-term contracts. For example, despite my best forecasts, in 5 or 7 years' time, I might need less gas than I had previously committed. If I have a deep and liquid market where I can perhaps resell that gas, or I have financial instruments, a financial market, derivatives market, where I can manage and offload that risk, I have that much more confidence in entering into a long-term contract. So again, creating liquidity in a market, creating more competition, allowing more players to come in, all of that market reform, which is the general direction the market has been, the introduction of the gas exchange, all of that needs to be pursued. And then the final piece in this whole thing is ensuring contract sanctity. Right? If you've entered into a contract, for 10 years, then we need to have the instruments to make sure that those contract obligations are adhered to and honored on both sides, both on the supplier side and the consumer side. And if there are any issues, then the dispute resolution around that takes place in an effective and quick manner. So if we can put that whole package together, systematic roadmap for which sectors to penetrate, where to see gas demand, build the supporting markets, both physical and financial, as well as the long-term sanctity that we need to see of those contracts, I think we've got a very, very bright future for gas in the country.
All these three factors that you named, the way you named them, do you see all of that happening, turning into?
Oh yes, I personally came back to India after almost 10 years overseas, and I feel like I've come into a completely different market. I think there's been very substantial progress across each of those dimensions. Across the gas chain, you look at upstream, we are actually producing much more gas than before. It's being sold on much more market-friendly terms. There are open auctions, for example, where everybody can participate. There's a much greater degree of marketing and pricing freedom for upstream molecules as well. The midstream is much more open for gas aggregators to come in and play. Pipeline access is much more easy to get than ever before. You're seeing a vast expansion of regas terminals all across the eastern and western coast of the country. That means getting access to regas terminals is much more easy than before. There's in fact surplus capacity in that space. You're seeing the national grid getting built out, the eastern part of the country getting connected, the southern part of the country getting connected, the CGD networks I spoke about as well. You're seeing an expansion in that space. Therefore, you're seeing much more customer choice in general, right? They've got LNG, they've got domestic gas, they've got many more suppliers who can meet their needs as well. You're seeing the emergence of the gas exchange as a place where, customers and suppliers can meet and contract as well. So all of these directionally are kind of moving in the right direction. We're not done yet. There's a lot more that needs to be done in each of those areas. But, I think directionally we're definitely moving in the right direction.
Okay. And I completely agree with you, Nakul, there. If I can ask one last question, on Shell's business. You slightly touched upon things like renewables, for example, or LNG trucking. I want to ask you, when it comes to this entire, new energy kind of landscape, what is Shell's larger growth strategy or plan to tap into this? If you could throw some light on that.
So that's another area actually, so we're very excited about the prospects in India, right? So the gas business, of course, I spoke to you about. We've got the Hazira LNG terminal, which established us as an early investor really in the gas and LNG business in India. It's been running very successfully since 2005. So we are very keen, of course, to grow our presence in the gas business as well, on the back of Hazira as well as on the back of other opportunities that I spoke about, for example, the domestic opportunities as well. But in addition to that, as we look at, into the new energy space, and let me talk about power in particular, which is an area I work very closely in. So we made, a very large investment in Spring Energy, which is one of the largest renewable energy producers in the country last year. Spring has an operating portfolio of something like 2.2 gigawatts of solar and wind capacity, which is currently in operation already, making it one of the top 10 renewable energy producers in the country. And that investment was actually the largest investment that Shell made in any renewable generation asset anywhere in the world. So that demonstrates, how excited we are about the prospects that India brings in this space. I'm currently working with Spring very closely to further enhance that portfolio. So previously, of course, all of Spring's PPAs were directed at utility customers. And while we continue to build that part of the business, we also want to move that business to serve the needs of commercial and industrial customers going forward as well. To begin with, in the renewable energy space, so meeting their needs for solar and wind power and associated solutions around that space, where we see a very large market emerging in India as well. So the combination of our gas business and this renewable power business is something that actually excites us a lot, and is something that we believe has a lot of potential to deliver over the next few years.
Fair enough, Nakul. It was such a pleasure talking to you. We've talked about a lot of really important things, from demand, supply, pricing, etc., and Shell's own strategy for growth. It was a pleasure having you, and thanks for your time. And we really look forward to hosting you again on this platform.
Thank you, Sudhir. A real pleasure meeting you today. Thank you.